Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. The topic for this webinar is Federal Marine Spatial Planning West Coast Update. We have some excellent guest speakers with us today. This webinar is being co-presented by Clean Energy Group and by the Pacific Ocean Energy Trust, also known as POET. Our host for this webinar is Val Story. Val is a project director here at Clean Energy Group. Before I pass this over to Val and our guest speakers, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our participants for this webinar are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of this webinar. You can either call in using a telephone or you can use your computer mic and speakers to connect. A very important note, we will be having a Q&A at the end of the webinar, and we want to answer as many questions as we can. So if you think of a question during our presentation, please type it in the question box on the webinar console. If your question is for a specific presenter, please let us know that this question is for them. If it's a more general question, we can ask it of everyone. But we'll save at least 20 minutes, 15-20 minutes at the end of the webinar for the Q&A. We want to get to as many questions as we can, and to make sure that we can get to your question, type it in when you think of it. Don't wait until the end to type in your question. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. You'll find a recording of this webinar along with all of our previous offshore wind webinars on our website at the web address you see on your screen. And we'll also send you a follow-up email sometime this afternoon with a link to the webinar recording and the webinar slides. So with that, I would like to pass it over to our host for this webinar, Val Story.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us and welcome to today's webinar on ocean planning on the West Coast as well as its implications for ocean energy development. As Sam mentioned, my name is Val. I'm a project director at the Clean Energy Group and the Clean Energy States Alliance. We are a nonprofit organization based in Vermont, and we work across the U.S. on innovative policy, technology, and finance programs in clean energy and climate change. Our offshore wind accelerator project has two main focuses. One is we work with states to help them in their efforts to advance offshore wind, and second, we engage in broad communication and stakeholder outreach efforts. We publish newsletters and, for example, host webinars. Among other things that I wanted to mention that we do in offshore wind is we host the Northeast Wind Resource Center. This is a U.S. Department of Energy supported effort, and through the NWRC we engage in multi-state and regional dialogue in New England and across 4 northeastern states including New York. And we also manage the Offshore Wind Hub, which is a comprehensive website with open access to regulatory and policy documents related to offshore wind for the majority of the Atlantic coast states. Today we are co-hosting this webinar with the Pacific Ocean Energy Trust, and I'm going to pass the mic over to Jason Bush, POET's Executive Director, to introduce both himself and his organization.
Thank you, Val, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I just wanted to make a couple quick comments. First of all, I want to thank Val and her great team at Clean Energy Clean Energy Group for co-hosting this with the Pacific Ocean Energy Trust and bringing this to all of you. I also want to thank the presenters, John, Andy, and Jennifer, for taking time out of their busy schedule to share some of their insights and expertise with us on the topic of marine spatial planning on the West Coast. Hopefully you'll learn some interesting things today. I also just want to say a few words about the Pacific Ocean Energy Trust. POET. Those of you who already know me probably do so through the Oregon Wave Energy Trust, OWET. I've been the executive director for OWET for the last 8 years, and recently we set up a new organization, the Pacific Ocean Energy Trust, which is essentially an OWET-type organization with slightly longer legs, taking the a regional approach for the West Coast and embracing all forms of marine renewable energy, promoting responsible development of marine energy along the West Coast. So it's a new organization and just getting our feet wet, and we're pleased to work with the Clean Energy Group on this webinar today. And for those of you in the California area, you may be interested in an event that's coming up on March 2nd in Sacramento called the 2017 California Offshore Wind Industry Symposium that POET is sponsoring and hosting in conjunction with the Business Network for Offshore Wind. If you want more information on that, you can find it easily online or reach out to me and we'll give you some more information about it. With that, I'll hand it back to Val. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jason. Yes, so as Jason mentioned, we have 3 guest panelists today. I will introduce each one ahead of his or her presentation. And to give you a quick overview, our first 2 panelists are going to update us on Washington and Oregon's state ocean plans, and then our third panelist is going to talk about how the West Coast Regional Planning Body is building off of the state's plans to support regional ocean planning. He will also cover the core functions of the regional planning body, and we'll cover a key component of the regional plan, which is the open access data portal, which houses under one roof dozens of data sets. So we will have sort of a 4th presentation on the data portal. We've also asked our panelists to explore how ocean planning and the data portal inform responsible ocean energy development and how the ocean planning efforts and these pre-development activities can lead to more efficient permitting and potential cost reductions. But before we dive into the West Coast's waters, I wanted to give you a quick overview of ocean planning and share some experiences from the East Coast, where the first 2 regional ocean plans, the Northeast Plan and the Mid-Atlantic Regional Ocean Plan, were regionally adopted. So, back in October, we held a webinar on Northeast Ocean Planning, and later on I'll share a link with you so you can listen to that recording, which is saved on our website if you're interested. But I wanted to give a quick summary and some highlights from that webinar, in particular how the ocean planning process has helped to facilitate offshore wind energy development in the Northeast. I'm sure, as many of you know, the long-term economic and environmental health of oceans and shoreline communities are significantly impacted by how oceans are used. In 2010, through a presidential executive order, the National Ocean Policy was established. It was established to guide the protection, the maintenance, and the restoration of America's coasts and oceans. The framework for the National Ocean Policy calls for the creation of regional planning bodies, and these have been established around the U.S., and they are meant to improve and help coordinate ocean planning by gathering input from and with communities as well as a broad range of stakeholders, including scientific and technical experts. The planning body is a joint effort run by consensus between federal and state agencies and tribes. And an interagency National Ocean Council oversees the implementation of the National Ocean Policy and ultimately reviews and approves any regional ocean plans that are presented by the regional planning body. As some of you may know, the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic Regional Ocean Plans recently became the first approved regional plans in the country. And the path to regional ocean planning was paved by the Rhode Island Ocean Special Areas Management Plan, an ecosystem-based management plan. And we heard a lot about this plan and Rhode Island's ocean planning process in the October webinar. And what really stood out to me was how the SAMP process was an effective tool that involved all stakeholder groups and that ultimately led to the successful permitting of the Block Island offshore wind farm, the nation's first offshore wind farm, and how Rhode Island's ocean planning process has become a model for several U.S. states. The process for Rhode Island's ocean planning process began in 2007 when Rhode Island's governor expressed interest in pursuing offshore wind energy. At that time, the state, through its coastal management program, initiated the Ocean SAMP process, that's Special Areas Management Plan process, which is a regulatory tool taking an ecosystem-based approach and involves a lot of public outreach and stakeholder consultation. The Coastal Management Program, along with several state agencies and the University of Rhode Island, worked to identify areas suitable for offshore wind development, not just by gathering data and using the best available outreach, but also talking to fishing communities and a broad group of stakeholders, and ultimately identified places where ocean development was and was not appropriate. For example, areas where the ocean bottom would not support pile driving were excluded for consideration for ocean development. The process also led to the identification of areas for further research and areas of concern, places where developers were encouraged not to go. So Block Island Wind Farm, the nation's first offshore wind farm, was ultimately located in an area that was accepted by fishermen, by tribes, by environmental NGOs, and by the local community. The SAMP process connected with and feeds into the Northeast Regional Ocean Plan and serves as a model for regional planning. If you do want more information about the Northeast process and the Rhode Island SAMP process, I want to direct you to our webinar. It was a 1-hour webinar back in October, and if you follow this link, it will take you to a recording of that webinar, which included panelists from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, URI, and the Northeast Regional Planning Body. So that's just a brief overview of where we've been in the Northeast. And now let's turn our focus to the West Coast. Our first presenter is Andy Lanier. Andy is the Marine Affairs Coordinator with the Oregon Coastal Management Program within the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development. He joined the Coastal Management Program after completing a 2-year NOAA Coastal Management Fellowship to create an ocean GIS database for the state. He's also currently serving as a co-chair of the West Coast Ocean Data Portal, which Andy will introduce towards the end of the webinar. Andy is a graduate from the Marine Resources Management Master's Degree Program at Oregon State University. I'm going to pass controls over to Andy for his presentation, and as a reminder, there is a question dialog box on your screen, and feel free to type in your questions for our guest panelists there, and after everyone has spoken, we will have a Q&A session. Thanks again.
All right, well, thank you very much for that introduction, and good morning to those of you on the West Coast, and I guess good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. I'm going to talk today about spatial planning in Oregon's marine waters. And I'd like to actually start out today with a little bit of history and some trivia. The photograph that you see here on my title slide is of the Three Arch Rocks, which exist off of Oregon's coast, off of the little community of Oceanside. And this area actually represents one of the first spatial designations on the West Coast. In 1907, by executive order, President Theodore Roosevelt declared Three Arch Rocks as a national wildlife refuge in response to the practice of the day, which was to go out on tugboats and use the area for target practice. So there were ecologists who responded to that practice and then fought to make this a national wildlife refuge, which it continues to do today, and that stewardship ethic continues. The state of Oregon has a long history of ocean planning. It goes back more than 30 years with the approval of Oregon's Coastal Management Program and with the adoption of statewide Planning Goal 19, the Ocean Resources Goal, which has been on the book since 1977, but that was modernized and updated in the year 2000. Goal 19 sets a priority for the sustainable long-term use of the renewable resources and requires new uses to protect those habitats and functions, as well as some of the users that are in that area. Oregon developed its basic ocean resources management program in the early 1990s in response to the possibility of oil and gas development in federal waters in the early 80s. An ocean resources management plan was created by a task force in 1990, which resulted in legislation in 91 that created a stakeholder group that put together our Territorial Sea Plan, which was originally adopted in 1994. The Territorial Sea Plan has been amended several times as new uses have come into Oregon's Territorial Sea. And the policy process by which those new uses are adopted is coordinated by Oregon's legislatively approved stakeholder advisory body, the Ocean Policy Advisory Council. As needed, the Council has the assistance of a Science and Technical Advisory Committee to make sure that the decisions that we are making are based upon the best and soundest science. So, to go back, Goal 19, which is the foundational principle, recognizes that Oregon as a state has a long-term interest in conserving the values, benefits, and natural resources of our nearshore ocean and continental shelf. And it does so giving the highest priority to the protection of those renewable marine resources. While doing so, it recognizes that we as a state and as a people benefit both economically and socially from the use of the territorial sea and those resources through providing services such as food for our communities. And it sets out that balancing act that we in the state have the responsibility to do, which is to try and protect both those ecological and economic interests. Again, recognizing though that the long-term values are dependent upon a healthy and diverse marine ecosystem and the habitats that those systems present. So this is what a spatial planning process in the state looks like. This is a poster that was generated several years ago for an ocean science conference. And at this point in time, the new use of wave energy was coming into the state. But our process would look like this even if it was a new use like offshore aquaculture. For any proposed new use, Oregon has a requirement that we look at and identify the existing resources, including the physical environment, the biological environment, and the human uses, including all of the things that have existing regulations that are out there, like shipping lanes or dredge material disposal sites, as well as the human communities that graze the ocean to provide us with food, so our fisheries. And it asks us, the state, to conduct an effects evaluation and assessment of what the potential impacts of this new use are relative to those existing users, and then request that we as a state plan or establish suitable locations for those new uses. So in Oregon, when we went through our planning exercise for marine renewable energy, those first 3 steps took over 5 years. Because we had an extensive resource inventory process, we reached out to the affected stakeholder communities and users and all Oregonians in a series of over 100 public meetings to create our plan and to establish suitable locations. Once we have the plan, then we have a responsibility to continue to monitor the actions and activities that occur within those areas to make sure that the effects that we're expecting are those that we see, and the requirement that we implement adaptive management if those things are not going as we thought. The state also has a vested interest in making sure that we just don't jump in and build things that aren't going to work, so we propose a phased development approach. And all of those steps really fundamentally go back to whether or not the uses are going to that Goal 19, whether they're consistent with Goal 19 and helping us to protect those valuable resources that we hope to use into the future. So when the state adopted the amendment to our Territorial Sea Plan, this is the framework that we adopted, and it includes different types of resource use areas. There's a lot of text on this slide, so I'm not going to read everything. But what I'd like you to take away from that is that we recognize that there were places where renewable energy was probably not appropriate, and we designated places that are exclusionary areas, and we also recognize that there were areas that there are already permits and that we would continue to allow activities in those areas. And so the standards that would be applied vary by the type of area that is specified within the plan. There's a ratcheting kind of system of standards, so the more resources and uses that are present within a specific type of area, generally the higher the protection standards are. And those change from the resources and uses conservation area to the resource and use management area, with kind of the area that we would like to target early development being our renewable energy facility suitability study areas. Those of you who know Rick Williams can thank him for that moniker. The state also recognized that there were issues that spanned across the entire territorial sea that our stakeholders cared about, and those were the aesthetic resources. So the state put in place a visual resource management system that would be applied anywhere within the territorial sea, and also the recreation areas. And so there's planning overlays that exist for both of those thematic uses. And when we are looking at or evaluating permit applications, those overlays and those standards will be applied. This is, excuse me, go back one. This is what our plan looks like, the plan map of the entire territorial sea. You can see the different areas highlighted in some of the inset boxes. The large majority of the territorial sea falls into that more restrictive category. But still, if a technology or a device user comes into that area and says, we believe our technology will not adversely impact or have significant impacts upon the resources that have been identified as there, the state hasn't said no. It said, okay, well, let's see, let's prove yourself to be able to go into that place. Part 5, the chapter of the Territorial Sea Plan that guides new applicants to what they need to know is quite comprehensive. It includes the background and policies for renewable energy facilities development. It includes implementation requirements, so it sets out the process by which we will evaluate the applications, including the establishment of a joint agency review team process, which will include the regulatory agencies that will be involved as well as local affected stakeholders. It includes the resource inventory and effects evaluation standards that will need to be met for a permit to be approved. And then it guides what the state wants to see in terms of an application as well as an operation plan for moving forward. The plan also includes recognition that the state has an interest in helping to develop these technologies through our National Marine Renewable Energy Center, and it has made special considerations for the continued use of a site to allow temporary, non-permanent technologies to be tested that are non-grid connected. And then finally it sets up a timeline for when we would review the plan to see if it's working. Moving beyond the territorial sea into our offshore waters, the Oregon Coastal Management Program has long had in its approved plan the presence of an ocean stewardship area, which goes from the shore out to the edge of the continental shelf. In doing so, it recognized that the uses and the resources that are present in that area often travel between nearshore waters and offshore waters. And the people who use the area travel between the nearshore waters and the offshore waters. So there's a recognition of one area being codependent upon another. In response to that interest, the state of Oregon submitted and has now an approved geographic location description, which goes from the edge of state waters out to 500 fathoms of depth. So that's partway down the continental slope. And the geographic location description, which is really a horrible moniker for what this document is really an ocean uses atlas with a description of the effects upon coastal resources and uses that may be expected to the valuable marine resources that Oregon has identified through its existing planning process. And it sets about the potential adverse effects from those uses and says that we are interested in reviewing any application for development within the geographic location description. And so we automatically, as a state, have the ability to apply our federal consistency determination and review to activities that are taking place out in that area. So what's next for the state of Oregon in terms of regional planning? Well, the state has signed on to both the charters for the West Coast Regional Planning Body and the associated West Coast Ocean Partnership, indicating its desire to maintain and coordinate with other agencies and entities in how our offshore waters are used. There are representatives from both my agency, the Coastal Management Program in Oregon, as well as our Fish and Wildlife agencies who sit on the regional planning body and or the partnership. We have had discussions in the state about whether or not a sub-regional RPB is appropriate, and we have had meetings with our Ocean Policy Advisory Council to gauge the interest of local governments and stakeholders. And if we as a state do agree to move forward as a part of regional planning exercises, those two entities, the local governments and stakeholders, want to have a seat at the sub-regional table. We do have, as mentioned through our marine spatial planning process, a comprehensive database of information gathered, which was focused on the territorial sea, but can be used in regional coordination of decision-making activities. I feel like our area, while it was focused on the territorial sea, didn't exclude information that was brought to the process that extended beyond the territorial sea. That's not to say that we have done a gap analysis to see what we're missing and whether or not there are other important resources that we should be identifying and mapping. But we have a good starting point. And finally, the last point I'll make is that because the state has relatively limited capacity, and because the investment in a process to create a regional plan may be heavy, there needs to be considerable benefits of the process that can help us to offset that investment in time and energy. So the state hasn't decided if it's going to move forward in this direction yet, but it's certainly considering it. So with that, I will pass things back to Val.
Thank you, Andy. Just a reminder, if you have questions for Andy, to type those in the question dialog box. And since we do have 3 presenters and 4 different presentations today, it would be helpful if you could just indicate to whom the question should be asked. So moving on, our next panelist is Jennifer Hennessy. She is a senior ocean planner for Washington State's coastal program at the Washington Department of Ecology. She's the lead for the state's marine spatial planning effort on Washington's Pacific coast, and she represents Washington State in regional marine planning activities. Jennifer coordinates a team of state agencies focused on improving ocean and coastal management for Washington's Pacific coast. She also serves as the West Coast Regional Representative to the Governance Coordinating Committee, which advises the National Ocean Council on national ocean policy. Jennifer holds an MS in Marine Resource Management from Oregon State University and a BA in Biology and Environmental Studies from Whitman College. Jennifer, thanks for joining us.
Great, thanks so much. So I'm going to talk today about Washington's planning process that's still underway on the Pacific coast. And just as Andy did, I'll give a little bit of context here in that Washington similarly has a long history of working to manage marine resources and shorelines in the state, being the first state in the nation to have an approved coastal zone management program back in the 70s, and adopting a Shoreline Management Act, which is a state-local partnership in managing shorelines and shoreline development and conservation, public access, and appropriate water-dependent uses. So with that in mind, several years ago there were many projects being proposed for marine renewable energy in particular, and both on the coast and in Puget Sound. And the Washington State Legislature felt that that given that new emerging use, as well as the focus at the national level on marine spatial planning, that it would be beneficial for the state to have a framework to develop marine spatial plans for its marine waters, and provided funding for the state to begin developing a plan for the Pacific coast. So that's a little bit of context on the reason why we're doing this planning process and the drivers that led us here. So in terms of our study area, when we're talking about the Pacific coast, this is a coastline of Washington State, minus Puget Sound, where Seattle and Tacoma and Olympia are. So our study area is from Cape Flattery at the mouth of the Strait of Juan de Fuca down to Cape Disappointment at the mouth of the Columbia River, and extends approximately 40 to 60 miles offshore. The red dotted line shows our study area, and the depth is about 700 fathoms offshore, following the contour of the continental slope there. And our study area is a very interesting place. It's home to a lot of existing ocean users, fishing and shipping primarily, as well as recreational uses. And it's also a complex, diverse array of management, federal, state, and tribal. There are 4 coastal treaty tribes that have usual and accustomed areas within our study area. It's home to Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary, National Marine Wildlife Refuges, and the Olympic National Park. So it's an interesting place to be planning around, and our legislature recognized that really we have enough laws in place that this plan should be one that is non-regulatory and really pulling together the information and providing a framework and guidance for new ocean uses. So that's the focus of our planning effort, is around addressing those new ocean uses like marine renewable energy that may be coming in the future, and how to balance those uses with protection of existing uses, protection of the environment and cultural resources and uses, providing a better framework for integrating our decision-making across our different agencies, and providing for new economic opportunities where we can meet those other goals. So the plan, as I mentioned, will be helping us by, and has already helped us, by compiling better baseline information on the uses and resources on our coast, providing ecosystem indicators to help us assess changes in the environment and in those uses, providing analyses to help support decision-making, and providing recommendations for guiding new ocean uses. And as I mentioned, providing a framework for agencies to better coordinate when there are projects proposed. The state law does provide several requirements that need to be included in our marine spatial plan, and those are things like a series of maps covering what we know about key ecological areas, human uses, and the potential for renewable energy. Developing an ecosystem assessment that tells us what we know about the status and trends of the ecosystem, providing recommendations on uses as well as protection of unique and sensitive features, providing both a way to implement the plan within our existing authorities, as well as for coordinating the review of, in particular, renewable energy projects. So the plan has 5 basic parts. The first part is really just background and purpose and introductory information. Part 2 are what we call the context chapters. These are a series of information that tells us what the baseline information is around current and potential new uses. Part 3 are where our analyses are. And Part 4 is what we're calling the management framework, which is really the actions that we'll take and the guidance that we're providing for new ocean uses. And then in our state, we have the State Environmental Policy Act, which is a environmental review process. And we are doing this as a programmatic EIS, so that means that we will be evaluating the environmental effects of adopting a plan, and that will likely be a separate document that we produce. So digging in a little bit into each of those sections, the better baseline information includes a wide variety of information on socioeconomics of the coast, archaeological and historic information, ecology, current ocean uses, as well as potential new uses. And that includes both quantitative information and qualitative information, as well as maps of what we know about where those uses are currently occurring, and where available, information about degrees of use, whether the areas are more heavily or less heavily used by different uses. So this is an example of one of the projects that we funded as part of our planning process. Similar to Oregon's, we've been developing a variety of information and compiling that information over several years. And so this was a project that we did with 0.97 as well as Surfrider, and it was a recreational use survey and trying to figure out which areas are used by recreators on our coast and getting in information about the economics of those trip expenditures off the coast. The colors in red show areas that were more heavily visited by visitors that were coming to the coast to recreate, as well as the trip expenditures here on the right. Another type of information that we gathered was information on commercial fisheries and recreational fisheries. This is the Dungeness Crab fishery, the commercial fishery. And you can see the darker red indicates higher fishing effort, and the lighter pink is lower effort. The hashes are indicative of management that is done with the tribes. So it doesn't mean that no fishing is occurring, but rather these are areas where tribal fishing occurs. And so those are negotiated with the tribes on an annual basis. And just a note about the crab fishery is that the value, one of the studies that we did was an economic analysis, and it helped us better understand the economic impacts of things such as fisheries to coastal communities. And we know that the Dungeness crab fishery, it represents a third to half of the value that the ex-vessel revenue that comes into the coast from fisheries that are operating off of the coast every year. So it's a big impact to the economy of the coast. So in part 3 of the plan, that's where we'll be summarizing a number of the analyses that we did as part of our planning process. So this particular map shows the ecologically important areas analysis, which looked at information around important marine habitats, information about fish distribution, seabirds, marine mammals, and in particular, this analysis looked at a subset of those that were deemed as particularly sensitive. So they were either listed as endangered and threatened species, such as the marbled murrelet, or they were very important habitats, such as rocky reefs or corals, or they were habitats like seabird colonies or marine mammal haulouts. We also looked at that data in different ways. So we have a map that looks at ecologically important area hotspots across all data, so all species and all habitats. And we have some other analyses that we're looking at currently in terms of comparing information about the North Coast versus the South Coast, because those habitats are very different along our coast, much rockier on the north, much sandier habitats on the south. And so in terms of looking at the sensitive information that we have, you can see that the red shows that there's a much higher importance for more things in the areas that are indicated by red. The areas that are very light blue means that there was no data, not that they're not important, but that there was no information there. So in terms of the that information, combining the ecologically important use information with other use information, we combined information, geospatial information for all of the different sectors that operate on the coast currently. Those include things like commercial and recreational fishing, aquaculture, recreation, transportation, including cargo, tanker, tug and tow. And we also adjusted some of the information to better understand for crab those areas where you saw the hashing for the Dungeness crab. We don't have how heavily the tribes use those areas, and so instead in areas where we know there's sandy bottom, that's where crab fishing occurs. And so in this map you can see that the higher, darker orange and red colors are areas that were used more heavily by more of those sectors. And we weighted that information proportional to intensity information where we had it. So this is another way of looking at the kind of information that could be helpful for a project proponent to understand the types of uses that they'll be intersecting with in a project, and who in particular might be affected. Another way of looking at that data that as we started sorting through things was comparing the number of high uses by those same sectors against the energy potential. And so we did commission a study with the Pacific Northwest National Lab to better understand for wind and wave technologies. They produced a number of different models that helped us understand the relative suitability from a technical standpoint, considering things like bottom type, water depth, distance to port, things that energy developers are interested in. And so in the green scales, we've converted that information into low, medium, and high energy potential. And the dark green shows those that are the most highest energy potential, but that also intersect with the fewest number of high uses. So those are those little dark green areas there that show up in here. And then the number of high uses here in yellow, and then the most number of high uses in red. And so you can see that there's a lot of dark red in this area where we have a lot of high uses occurring off the coast, and it also has a high energy potential. So just another way of looking at the information and making some summaries. So part 4 is the management framework, and as I mentioned, that's the area where really our recommendations are coming forward and the guidance that we're providing on applying our existing policies and regulations. So within that, this will seem somewhat familiar because I thought that the Oregon program, when they talked about the process for evaluating uses, was a really helpful visual. So when a proposed new use comes in, our hope is that the Marine Spatial Plan provides a lens by which an applicant can look at the baseline information and better understand what's already existing in the landscape. We also have recommendations that speak to the kind of information that at a site-specific level they would need to compile, the kinds of effects that we think would need to be analyzed, both in terms of the environmental effects but as well as the social and economic effects, a number of plans that help us better understand their compliance with a variety of our existing policies, and then how they will adaptively manage the project. And our core authority here is the Ocean Resources Management Act, or ORMA, and that law has been similarly on the books for a long time. It was developed in response to oil and gas leasing off of Washington's coast and sets forth a number of important policies for us to follow in terms of ensuring that there's no significant long-term adverse effects to coastal uses or resources, and that all reasonable steps are being taken to avoid and minimize adverse impacts to uses as well as to the environment. So in our plan, we also spell out how an applicant can do outreach, and in particular, it focuses on early coordination with agencies and tribes, as well as the affected fisheries. and then other coastal stakeholders and groups. And one of our important groups on the coast is the Washington Coastal Marine Advisory Council. It was established in law and is housed under the governor's office, and includes a really diverse array of coastal stakeholders. And so within our plan, there are certain requirements for meeting with those groups, notifying them of a project, and encouraging a process to understand their concerns about a project and working with them to minimize impacts. So we also have spatial recommendations. Again, this is a non-regulatory plan, so we have designated and identified within state waters particular areas called important, sensitive, and unique areas, or ISUs. And these are areas that we are working to protect sensitive and unique areas from offshore development. So these are some of the examples of what the draft ISUs are currently in the draft that we've been working on. Things like coral, kelp, rocky reef, bird colonies, and forage fish spawning areas. We also are recommending that applicants, that agencies will be evaluating them on a case-by-case basis. So unlike Oregon, we didn't do a detailed process to zone or provide specific designations in state waters other than the ISUs, but that we're encouraging them to avoid adverse impacts to existing uses in ecological areas, and identifying that, as a project is proposed in an area that has more uses and more ecologically important areas, or that have greater intensity of uses, that that will likely result in a more difficult permitting process. In the number of analyses that we did, we realized that industrial scale projects in state waters would take up a significant amount of space. And so one of our key recommendations is that industrial scale projects, ones that would be designed for energy at a scale for the regional grid, would not be compatible in state waters, and that rather we would prefer to look at community scale type projects, ones that are designed to be providing energy to a local community or set of communities, and that have the support of that community. Again, that's only for state waters. So our next steps, we are in the process of completing research drafting and incorporating recommendations from our advisory council and others. We're hoping to have a preliminary plan out for our advisory council and tribes to be able to take a look at this month. And then later in spring, we plan to have a draft plan and draft EIS out for public comment, and are aiming to have the final plan adopted by this summer. In terms of the regional planning body, I serve as one of our 2 state representatives on the regional planning body, and we certainly have been exploring the idea of a sub-regional effort with tribes and with federal agencies that builds off of our state planning process. So we certainly have put a lot of effort into this plan and want to see it used, but also acknowledge the need to have a place where we can coordinate with tribes and the federal agencies on an ongoing basis. So with that, I'll hand it back to Val.
Thank you, Jennifer. Great presentations, and thanks to those of you who are typing in your comments. Just again, a reminder to go ahead and type in any questions in the question dialog box, and if you can, indicate to which panelist I should address the question at the end of the presentations. So moving right along, our next panelist is John Hanson, who serves as coordinator of the West Coast Regional Planning Body. Through these efforts, Mr. Hanson supports federally recognized tribal governments, state governments, and federal agencies along the Pacific coast of the U.S. to coordinate and develop ocean planning and governance approaches. Before coordinating the West Coast Regional Planning Body, John coordinated the West Coast Ecosystem-Based Management Network, and he received his BS in aquatic biology from the University of California at Santa Barbara, and he received his Master's of Marine Affairs from the University of Washington. John, thank you for joining us.
Great. Thanks, Val, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for the chance to join you this morning and speak a little bit about the West Coast Regional Planning Body and what we're up to and building around efforts that were just discussed from Andy and from Jen. The intro of those efforts were really appropriate, and as you hear about the RPB, we're really working around existing efforts, and that'll be a theme of some of the things I highlight in terms of the nuts and bolts of the RPB, but really emphasizing that folks like Jen and Andy are the ones doing all of the hard work that you just saw, and we at the RPB level are really trying to leverage that and really build around it and bring partners together to really make use of that work, create some new efficiencies and coordination between government partners, and then really try to reach out to stakeholders on the West Coast and build around this idea of ocean planning. So let me make sure I have the slides here and hopefully can jump in. I will skip through these around the national context. Val did a great job introducing these at the national scale, but we usually try to highlight the National Ocean Policy and President Obama's executive order as an impetus, as that started this idea of regional planning bodies around the U.S. As you heard, the East Coast RPBs got off and running a few years before we did on the West Coast, and so they completed plans at the end of last year, which we were really excited to see and are really now interested to see how those are implemented. We've been tracking those and seeing how they've played out as the starting point began in 2010 with the executive order and some of the key pieces here around federal agency participation, the Governance Coordinating Committee, or GCC, that Jennifer Hennessy is a member of and represents the West Coast, and some other elements there around how the feds have worked on this. But for the West Coast, we're a few years behind that pace, but really excited with where we're starting here in our region. So again, this is the context of the executive order. Those are the 9 regions that are laid out for the U.S. There's an implementation plan and a marine planning handbook that were developed by the Obama administration to help guide the work of these RPBs. Those were guidelines and really kind of a recipe book for how these things could get started. But a key point is that it's up to each region to figure out what the best fit for them was. And so that's something each region has really taken upon themselves. And for us on the West Coast, as I'll talk about, have a little bit of a different flavor than the other regions, but one that's similar in some ways, but really is trying to address some of the different facets of our region that set us apart in a few different areas. So I highlight the map here in just larger detail, and I usually do this in every one of my updates, partly just to highlight how big our region is here, if people can see my cursor at all. We have this big green blob on the West Coast that covers the entire West Coast, the extent of the 3 West Coast states, out to 200 miles. I never can resist poking fun at our East Coast regions and how they're a bit smaller than us, but obviously have done a lot of work there and gotten their plans done. And so we, for the West Coast, I think, again, have taken a bit of a different approach, but really looking to how these regions have set themselves up, and really applaud the East Coast regions for the plans they were able to complete, and something that we're really just starting to think about here on the West Coast. So the way these regional planning bodies, or RPBs, are defined, they're initiated by state and tribal governments. This is a key piece, and a question I get a lot is this, because it's coming from an executive order as a starting point, something that the feds are going out and telling the regions to do, that they have to do? And that's really not the case. The idea is that marine planning is a tool that can be used by regions to better coordinate and communicate around ocean issues, both current and emerging uses, but that it's up to the states and the tribal governments in each region to determine if they even want to form an RPB. So you have some regions that have formed RPBs, you have others that have chosen not to, but this is something that the states and tribes really sort of drive the dialogue in terms of how these things are formed. If there is a decision to form one, the membership is made up of federal, state, and tribal governments, along with the regional fishery management councils in each region. They are voluntary, as mentioned, and they are non-regulatory. That's another key point, in that these RPBs do not create any kind of new regulation. They do not impact existing law, treaty, or other existing structures, but are really meant to work to enhance existing efforts and legal structures. The way the executive order laid it out through the previous administration was that these final plans would be implemented by federal agencies. Obviously, we have a new administration in place, and there's a bit of a shift, I guess you could say, at the national level. Nothing specifically has changed around the National Ocean Policy as far as we understand it, but as the previous executive order laid it out, these plans were approved and implemented by federal agencies, and that was the only responsibility of actual implementation. It was up to state and tribal governments to determine if and how they would implement any planning outputs themselves, but the feds, through the executive order, did have the responsibility to implement it as they were most able to. So for the West Coast, as I mentioned, we're taking a bit of a different approach based on a few different factors and things that we've been dealing with over the last few years. A big one for us, I've already talked about, is scale. We have a big region. There's a lot of work that's already happened around marine planning, and you've heard a couple of great examples of it just in the last two presentations. And so we have a lot of area to deal with, so we've really thought a lot about how do we really meaningfully engage with the governments and the stakeholders in this large area of coast that we have on the West Coast. Governance, again, is another issue. We have obviously three large states that are very active in ocean management and ocean planning in various ways. And then we have a large number of federally recognized tribal governments. And those tribes are located in many different areas around the coast. They have different approaches and different legal structures related to ocean management and authorities. And they have various degrees of interest and capacity and topics that they're most concerned with addressing. And so that's really played into our approach here and how we set up a West Coast regional planning body. I've already mentioned existing plans as a big part of our discussion. A point of emphasis has been we do not want to come in and reinvent the wheel with anything. We think these wheels are really fantastic, and you just saw the amount of work that's gone into them. So really it's been more, are there areas that we can help and provide benefit and not get in the way of things that are already working. And then again, stakeholder engagement. That's a huge piece for us. The last couple of years, as I'll talk about, has been a little bit more focused on the government side of things and getting all of the right players on the management and coordination side pulled together. What we're really embarking on now in 2017 is a concerted effort around broader engagement and outreach. And so that's something, obviously, we're really excited to have opportunities like this to get in front of such a large group, to tell the group that this RPB even exists, but really start to think more directly about how we engage in a meaningful way. So a bit of history of the group and how it came together. In 2012 was really when things got rekindled for the West Coast region and getting things started in this idea of forming a regional planning body. The Fed started talking more directly. NOAA was the lead agency for the federal family on the West Coast region. So they initiated reaching out to the full suite of federal agencies to talk about the executive order and how the feds could better organize, and exploring if this would be something that would stood up on the West Coast. There was also a tribal government assessment that was initiated. A number of tribes expressed interest in learning more about the executive order and the potential participation in this process. So a contract was hired out through a consulting firm to go out and talk to a number of tribes. There were about 40 or so tribes that were included in that, which entailed in-person meetings with each tribe, a lot of outreach and substantive discussion around if and how this were to engage tribes, what would that look like. In 2013, I came on board late that year, so I was the only first formal staff for the RPB, and remain so to this point in terms of formal support for the RPB. And I really helped with the initial federal organization, and then started to reach out more directly with interested tribes and the three West Coast states, folks like Jen and Andy, to talk about if we did this on the West Coast, what would it look like from a tribal perspective and from a state perspective, and starting to get some of that feedback. And then over 2014, that feedback started to come in. We had a more formal structure set up where we brought together interested tribes along with the three states and the federal agencies to just have an initial dialogue about what is this idea, do we want to do it, and if so, what is it going to look like for the West Coast. So jumping into 2015, the first time we all sat around a table was in January of that year. We met up in Portland, Oregon, and at that point we sat around the table not as an RPB, but just as a number of different governments across tribal, state, and federal representatives, and we had the discussion around, do we even want to do this? At the end of a half-day meeting, we decided we did. We had consensus from everybody there in the room to form an RPB, so that really kind of started the clock on getting this thing formed. And one of the first steps was drafting a charter, so really getting on paper how would this group form itself, what would the process and the participation look like, and how do we really reach consensus on that. We started to get more targeted feedback from our RPB membership in different areas of the coast to see what this could look like for them and how it would be helpful, and then started to really talk about this idea of regional versus sub-regional approaches. Both Jen and Andy mentioned this idea of sub-regional regional planning bodies, or sub-RPBs. Sub-regional planning teams is the name we've now given them, and I'll talk in more detail about that. But a key piece for us is really, this is a big region, there's a lot of work, a lot of stakeholders, and a lot of different issues. it's probably not something we can take off in one big bite right from the start. So we've really then landed on subregions as a way of really moving into more substantive conversations around different issues for different areas of the coast. It's something we're just starting on. We're really trying to think through how we do this effectively. But again, this key point of building on existing efforts is a key facet of this in terms of subregions. So the way we set up the RPB, this is the structure of the group. In terms of membership, again, it is limited to federally recognized tribal governments, state governments, and federal agencies. As you can see, it's voluntary participation from federally recognized tribes and states. Each tribe has a seat. Each state gets 2 seats. They determine who to appoint to the RPB in terms of representing that government. But again, it's entirely voluntary. So a state does not have to participate if they don't want to. Likewise for a tribe. I'll go through the specific membership we do have set up, but we're very excited, obviously, to have the 3 states signed on to the charter at this point, and we have roughly a dozen tribes that are signed on as well. As called out in the executive order, if there is an RPB, federal agencies have to participate, so that's the one area where it's not voluntary. If there is an RPB that is formed in a region, the feds will be there and participate, and I can say for the West Coast, the feds have been engaged from the start and really supportive of the process. And we also have the Pacific Fishery Management Council on the RPB. This is another key question that comes up related to fisheries issues, and the PFMC is meant to be on the group to really be able to coordinate around fisheries-related issues, but clarify that we don't have any authority over fishery management decisions or otherwise. That still remains with the Fishery Council. We have an executive secretariat that is made up of leads from the federal, tribal, and state government side of things. That's really more for administration, keeping the wheels turning, so to speak. And then this idea of sub-regional planning teams is how we're looking at sub-regions, is really looking at more of the on-the-ground implementation of planning work. The way the RPB looks at plans is that a plan can really be whatever the group thinks makes sense. If it's a spatial plan, if it's enhanced coordination, if it's focused on data, it's up to the group to decide, and that may differ between different subregions, and that's something we're in the midst of discussing right now. And it's really flexible. As talked about already, this is up to the group to see what is this going to do to help. We don't want to force folks to create a team, create plans if they're just going to be replicating things that are already in place or things that are already working well. So if it's very little, if it's just very targeted aspects of work that we can help with, that's where the RPB is really trying to be responsive of that. So federal government members, I won't go through these in detail for the sake of time, but you can see it ranges across the board from DOD to Energy to DOI. NOAA was the federal co-lead. We're in the midst of discussing who the new federal co-lead for the West Coast region will be. That was not actually due to the administration change, but was because the previous lead, John Stein, at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center up in Seattle, retired in January, so he has left NOAA, and so now we're in discussions with the federal agencies to determine who will step in as the new federal co-lead, and that hasn't been decided quite yet, but we hope to get that word soon. On the state side, we have the 3 West Coast states. As mentioned, Andy was with DLCD in Oregon. DLCD and DFW represent Oregon. Jennifer is with the Department of Ecology in Washington, and her agency and DNR represent their state. And then in California, we have the Ocean Protection Council, which is housed within the Resources Agency as one member, and then the State Lands Commission now has formally joined on as the RPB. I should remove that asterisk. They are the other state member. Just as a clarifying point here, even though each state has 2 seats formally, they are meant to really represent the state as a whole, so they are intended to work with the full suite of state agencies that work on ocean issues, but channel it through these representatives specifically to speak on behalf of state matters. And then these are the tribal governments that we have signed on. The 2 with asterisks, technically we don't have a signature yet, but I know they're in the midst of trying to finalize their signature, which comes through usually tribal councils or tribal leadership to formally sign on. But as you can see, these are tribes that range from the coast up in Washington into Oregon and into Northern California. At this point, we have no tribal reps from Central or Southern California. We're working on some increasing outreach in those areas of the coast, but just initially had less expression of interest from tribal governments in Central and Southern California as we did Northern California and northward. So looking at 2016 and what we did, we finished our charter in February of 2016, so we had the charter done. We've been getting signatures on it, so that's really put that process in place, which has been obviously a necessary starting point. But from there, we've kind of moved from the process side to looking at how do we really start thinking about what we're actually going to do with this RPB now that we have it. So that's looked at subregions, it's looked at the data portal, and Andy's going to speak to the data portal in more detail after I finish my slides, so you'll hear more about that. We started an ocean assessment inventory looking at science to inform any planning that the RPB might support in some ways, and making sure the science is captured in the right way. Looking at issues that are out there. What are people concerned with and dealing with around existing and emerging uses, of which ocean energy is a huge one, but trying to get some feedback on what we might start thinking about in terms of topics, and then developing these sub-regional approaches. So just in October of last year, this photo here is a picture of our in-person meeting. So we gathered with all of our signatories along with the public audience. We had about 100 or so folks in total at the meeting, so it was a great gathering, and the first time formally we met in person as an RPB. As mentioned, the last time we got together before this was in January of 2015, but had not yet formed an RPB with a signed charter. This was our first gathering as a chance to do that. Spent 2 days talking about things you've just heard about, but in a little bit more depth, and then talking about next steps of the group. So things that we've come up with now in terms of looking ahead are some key pieces here around defining our objectives and the functions of the group, and I'll talk about that in a second. Looking at data coordination, that's an absolutely huge piece for us on the West Coast, and something Andy can talk about in more detail. Looking at the assessment in terms of initiating more in-depth work around science, and then, communications and engagement plan. So that's one where we now have a finalized C&E plan, as we call it, that's trying to capture how we roll out more effective engagement. It's something that's on our website now, and we've sent out on our listserv, and something I'd encourage folks to give us feedback on and ideas about how we do that more effectively, and then engage some of these sub-regional dialogues in different parts of the coast. So looking at the objectives, I won't go through these in too much detail for the sake of time, but I'm really trying to highlight the themes of what the RPB is focusing on. It's not necessarily this idea of just creating a marine spatial plan or quote-unquote ocean zoning for the whole West Coast. It's really focused on decision-making, and how do we look at planning as being something that can support work that's out there, but based around the priorities of the government and stakeholder partners that we want to work with. Information sharing and data coordination is a huge piece of this. So across the board, if you're talking about planning or anything else, info and data is going to drive that, and so that's something we want to be able to support. And then looking at these existing and emerging uses. What's happening in our ocean? How can we help plan around that? And then look at compatibility and really look at transparency and efficiency of government actions. There are a lot of governments across federal, state, and tribal entities, and so we want to help coordinate around that and make people aware of it, be able to provide areas of input and opportunities to engage that maybe couldn't be otherwise done without a regional group like this. So looking at functions of what we would actually do to achieve those goals, again, these are drafts, so they're not finalized and something the RPB is still discussing, but really lay out in these 5 areas. Coordinating and communicating on a regional scale, at a sub-regional scale, looking at how we can engage and strengthen those efforts, so like the state of Washington's work and tribes that are working in that area of the coast, likewise with Oregon, things that are happening in California, how do we engage and strengthen those? When we do see these different areas having different types of planning products, can we help with harmonizing those? So people planning around topic X are aware of people planning around the same topic in a different area of the coast, and helping those communicate and coordinate with one another. And then just build partnerships. There are a lot of things out there around planning, around ocean acidification, around climate and others, trying to build those channels so people can be aware of those more effectively. And then last but really not least is this idea of data coordination and information sharing. We're looking to the West Coast Ocean Data Portal that Andy will talk about as our primary conduit to do that. They were up and running before the RPB was, so they've been around longer than we have, and it's a channel that we really see as an effective means to bring data and information in a more available and easily accessible way that can inform planning, but inform really a number of uses for the West Coast region. So we've talked about subregions in some detail. The way it's laid out in our charter is that we would, if RPB members choose to do so, they can create subregional planning teams, or SRPTs. The priority there, again, to build on existing efforts. RPB members within these areas of the coast determine whatever approach they think makes the most sense. So as mentioned, folks in Washington, both at the state and tribes on the coast there, have started to talk about a potential subregion there. You have the state's work, you have tribes working on marine planning. They are just starting to think about how does that coordinate between those parties, and be an effective means to communicate on things, but also look at what are the needs that we can help with. We had a meeting just a few weeks ago in Olympia where we just got tribal, state, and federal agencies talking about that, so we're still early in that process. But really looking to them to define what is the process, how do we engage with stakeholders, what does the planning product look like, and how does that play out over time. That in Washington could be a different conversation than it might be in Oregon or in different areas of California, and those are things we're just starting to dig into, but at the end of the day we're really looking for the RPB members to give us the direction of how we can help set that up and build around these existing processes that are there, but also not get in the way of things that are already effectively being done. So really key points there: defer to existing efforts, no impact on existing authorities or regulations or plans, and really look to how do we enhance and increase efficiency and transparency. Some of the examples I list here on the slide I've already talked about with the Territorial Sea Plan in Oregon that you heard about from Andy, and the state of Washington's work in Washington. Likewise, you have some tribes working on marine planning on the coast there as well. And then a last point here on California. This is a question that's come up because it's been, I think, on people's radar a little bit more increasingly in the last few months, is the state of California's Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Task Force that BOEM is supporting. That was a task force that was requested by the governor in California and that BOEM has done in other areas of the country, and is looking at renewable energy off the coast there. There is a proposal for wind energy in the central area of the coast, and that's been an impetus for starting that conversation. And the state is leading efforts around data gathering and planning, and BOEM supporting that, and looking at a approach that they've done in other areas of the coast that's been really successful. A key point here is that this is not something that the RPB is putting under its umbrella. It's not something that's a subregion for us. It's something that BOEM is supporting because the state of California has requested it, and it's separate from the RPB. But I will say BOEM has been a huge supporter and engager for the RPB's efforts in terms of being fully linked into the RPB's work, providing updates to the group. And I think that's a key piece of this as an example where BOEM is really excited to share updates on this work with the rest of the RPB. And I think over time, as that process develops, it'll be something that we can look to the RPB as providing conduits for updates, providing areas of support, whatever it might be. But that is a process that's separate from the RPB, but something we're interested to be able to get information on. So looking at next steps, we have a communication and engagement plan. We're implementing that now, so that's on our website. I would encourage folks to take a look at that, but reach out to me to learn more. Getting feedback on these sub-regional ideas and how we move forward there, and looking at existing and new emerging planning issues, again, of which ocean energy is a big one, and then building partnerships that we can really enhance as we move forward. So I'll leave that with my contact info there, and I believe that I'll go out in a summary as well, but I'll stop there, and thank you all for the time to provide an update. Hand it back to you, Val.
Great, thank you, John. You've covered a lot of ground, and questions are coming in. I want to turn it back over to Andy to talk about the West Coast Data Portal, and then we will conclude with the Q&A session.
Great. Well, thank you again, and welcome. John has mentioned the West Coast Ocean Data Portal several times, so I feel like I almost don't need to introduce it, but I do feel like I need to recognize that I am a spokesperson for an effort where a lot of people have contributed a lot of time and a lot of effort to make the Ocean Data Portal a success. I'd like to reach out and thank my co-chair, specifically Steve Steinberg, who's a member of the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project. And it's great to have a counterpoint down in California to help figure out what's happening down there and to be able to participate in both parts of the world on our West Coast. I'd also like to recognize Allison Bailey, who is the principal consultant for our effort and has provided a lot of technical assistance and work to members of our West Coast Ocean Data Network, which have spent numerous hours working to make this project a success. Just briefly, I want to talk about the benefits that regional data portals have provided to the regional planning body efforts. And you've heard John discuss the needs for data coordination among multiple entities. So that is certainly the case, and a portal that can synthesize information from multiple sources is is a needed asset when you're talking about coordinating at the scale of the West Coast or even at the scale of the states along the West Coast. And in doing so, what we really want to produce is an organized and searchable catalog of information that is curated in a way so that you can easily discover, find out what you need to make the decisions that you have to make. And all of that is based upon some general metadata rules. So nobody likes to talk about metadata. But to get your information into the portal, and we are connecting multiple entities who produce and synthesize information, to get it into this process, you need to have your metadata in the right format. So we've worked hard to make sure that we provide guidance to others who want to participate. And then also that when our data sources are providing information, that they provide access to either the ability to download the data, to look at the sources and the quality of it, or to pull it in as web services. So, technology allows us today to have the most up-to-date information through services that are being provided directly from the source, so that we as a portal community don't have to continually go back and update information. The two images you see on the screen here are examples of some of the work that we did over the last year to create story maps, which include not only geospatial information but also relevant documents or movies about topics of interest. And we were asked to create a couple of these. One of them is about changing ocean uses, which actually explores marine renewable energy topic area. So I highly encourage you to take a look at that. And another is about the changing ocean conditions that we're facing on the West Coast. So who are the data providers that are out there in the community working to help us stay tuned to what those conditions are and how we as a society are going to need to move forward understanding those changes. To step back a moment, we are a project that was started under the West Coast Governors Alliance on Ocean Health. We are transitioning to attempt to support this regional planning body entity. And the first thing that we need to do is recognize that there is quite a variety of entities who have a responsibility to produce data related to the ocean and coastal environment. You see them listed here. There are tribal governments, there are branches of the federal government, there are state entities and organizations, and then there are regional organizations. And we were asked when we stood ourselves up to be a bridge between these entities and not be a duplicative organization that just collected everyone's data and housed it in a warehouse, so to speak. So we view ourselves as the connective tissue, and our data catalog does this. It pulls from all of these different providers up and down the West Coast so that we can better enable our public to discover, connect, and inform themselves about the important information that they need. We have created a catalog of the records, and we've done so by curating different topic areas of interest. As I mentioned, we weren't stood up to support the RPB, so that's something that we need to transition to do over the next year or so, is to generate areas of the catalog that are curated specifically for trying to support these sub-regional groups who are standing themselves up. And along the way, we need to make sure that we're connecting with the appropriate people and the appropriate agencies and data providers so that when we do so, we have the best information and we can reach out to the people who have their hands on the data and make sure that we're doing the right job of curating that network. And then finally, because we do have quite a range of practitioners who participate with us, we have a lot of expertise in developing software or technology that can be used to inform specific decision makings. On the right, you see a graph of marine debris cleanup areas, and we spent a lot of time in the past to try and organize cleanup information that was being derived from a number of different sources so that you could identify one particular set of debris if you were interested in that. So there's tools that can be developed. There's a network of people behind this effort up and down the West Coast, so the practitioners who are involved know each other, have been communicating regularly. This is all a strength of one of the things that we've built as part of the West Coast Ocean Data Portal. So we harvest from existing systems and data catalogs. We can help to synthesize those unique data products with our partners. And one of the most important parts is that we are trying to facilitate data providers to be able to ask us to include their data in the portal as a part of the planning process. And we do make some great resources available. If you look on our portal site under the Inform tab, there's an excellent database or knowledge base about how you can actually structure your metadata and your files so that they can be ingested by us and curated by us and presented then to anybody who's searching for that information along the West Coast. So with that, I will hand things back over to Val and
Thanks, Andy.
get the question and answer.
All right, thanks to all of you. We are quickly winding down on our time together, so I wanted to run through some questions that came in. We've got quite a few. Apologies that we won't make it through all of them. So let's start talking with a question for all of you, and feel free to answer if you've got the information, but how much does it cost the state to undertake planning? I know that's a big question, but what might budget be for a year and how is it funded? And then regarding the RPB, how do you leverage state and tribal resources?
Well, this is Jennifer, and at least for Washington, we received funding from the legislature to do our planning process, so that enabled us to do a number of projects to collect additional information and to also fund staff to help develop our website and the mapping application, as well as do the research and writing for the plan. But what I will say is, from my experience, it really varies from state to state, depending on the resources you have at hand. So many planning processes just do the best they can with the resources they have. So it's kind of hard to answer sort of what a standard budget would be. I think you just have to adjust your expectations in terms of what you'll be able to accomplish if you're trying to do it within sort of existing staff resources. Typically, most of these processes require GIS staff to help compile the data and information, as well as policy and planning staff to actually guide the process itself. So.
And from the RPB side, this is John, just to speak to that question about leveraging, that's really obviously a key facet of what the RPB has tried to do in terms of leveraging both the existing work that the states are undertaking and tribes as well around marine planning and tap into those as efficiently as we can. So we don't look to the states or the tribes to obviously provide funding or resources in sort of the standalone way. It's more using the in-kind time of folks like Jen and Andy to participate and have these discussions around how to coordinate, but then work with groups that are already there through either the planning processes themselves or advisory groups like OPAC in Oregon, the Ocean Policy Advisory Council that I've visited and presented to, or groups that Jen works with on the coast there to try to leverage those opportunities so that we're not unnecessarily creating new advisory groups or bodies that are getting in the way of things, but really trying to leverage the things that are already there, which is a key piece of our effort.
Yeah, I think John and Jennifer did a pretty good job of answering, but I would say that the most important part of our spatial planning process, and probably the most costly, was the effort that we did to conduct our resource inventory. So make sure that we had the right information, and then that we had the ability to package that information up into a tool that could be used by stakeholders who are involved in the process. So those were probably the most costly pieces, but given what Jen said, there are a whole lot of other factors that go into that.
That makes sense. Thank you. Well, here's another general question for the three of you. What are some of the opportunities and some of the challenges of working on ocean issues in areas where tribal, local, state, and federal authority overlaps? And specifically regarding the RPB, it's not a regulatory body, but are there any kinds of decisions the RPB can make, perhaps when a key actor, decision maker, isn't present in the conversation?
This is John. I can speak from the RPB end of things, just maybe initially to answer the second part, and that the RPB process, again, key point is that it's not regulatory. So there's nothing the RPB would decide that would affect existing regulations or plans or laws. And again, really the focus of the RPB is consensus, and that was a key point in the working through our charter document, and it took almost a year to get to the right point, and that we finished that partly because of this question around how do we make decisions. And the decision through the group was really made, we are not going to do anything unless everybody's on board, and that includes federal agencies, the states, and tribal governments. And so the point of the RPB is not to try and find areas where we're going to be butting heads, but really see what are we all on the same page about. And I think as the process has developed, that's been a lot of different things that have really come to the fore, that people realize we want to have more data accessibility, we want to coordinate more effectively, we want to address these issues. And so that's where the RPB has landed in terms of finding that consensus. A key piece is that we, as the membership side of the RPB, it is just the government partners, so those are the ones that are going to decide the way to implement these things through their existing authorities. A key piece for us moving forward is that stakeholder engagement and outreach piece. So that's where we want to be able to find channels to get effective input and feedback from the industry community working on renewable energy and NGOs and local government and others, and try to find the right way to channel that either regionally or sub-regionally. And that's a big conversation, but it's one that feedback would really be helpful on. And so that's just one plug I'll put to say to those that are interested in exploring this more, please feel free to contact me. But at the end of the day, it's up to folks like Jen and Andy from the state side and from our tribal reps to determine how to reach consensus on things, and that's really been a driver for us.
And this is Jen. Just to add to that, I think one of the main challenges that I've seen in the work that we've done is just that there's a number of groups to coordinate with, and they have varying levels of capacity to engage, and so that makes it challenging just to make sure that everybody is up to speed and providing input, and at the same time that you're providing a process for further coordination after the plan is developed. I think we're not going to have complete information on everything, and that's for very good reasons. Tribes and federal agencies have certain data that is very sensitive and that they're not going to share in a plan like this, but having a process to communicate and coordinate when a project does come up and making sure that our plan is to the best degree possible aligned with the interests across all of those groups is going to help us in the future. So.
Great. Andy, anything to add?
Yeah, I think, as Jen mentioned, the challenge of integrating kind of perspectives from different levels of government is significant, but it's also one of our largest opportunities in this area. And it provides a place where we can all talk about what we vision our ocean uses being and the appropriate uses of them. And I do think that ocean renewable energy fits into that that box. And I think that when we find a way to have those conversations that can include local government perspectives all the way up to the federal government, then you can actually reach a much broader consensus and agreement, and when you move forward to implement those, there will be much more support for that in the long run.
Great, thank you. I know we're running out of time. I just wanted to run one more question by you, and actually this is a question specific for Jennifer. Jennifer, you mentioned that industrial grid-tied projects wouldn't be recommended in state waters. Can you expand on that and give us a few details on how you define industrial scale? Is it by capacity, or are there other criteria? And then the second part to this question is, would, for example, undersea cables coming from a project out in federal waters be allowed to run through state waters back to shore?
Right. So great questions. So we, in our analyses, and I didn't show all the detailed analyses that we've run, but we did an example run using a tool called MarkSan that was trying to achieve a goal of 200 to 300 megawatts of offshore wind. So that was based off of kind of other projects we've seen and what we would have anticipated that a project might look like in the next 10 to 20 years in terms of a scale. And so we did that analysis, and it showed a very large footprint that would be required for a project of that size in state waters. So we looked at it across the different data sets that we had and came up with a variety of different footprints, whether it was a nearshore monopile type technology versus offshore floating wind. And so that gave us a good sense, working with our stakeholders, of what the potential impacts might be to the users in those areas, and had lots of conversations about, both aesthetic impacts, but also, as I mentioned in my presentation, the Dungeness crab fishery, which primarily operates in that nearshore area, and the kinds of conflicts that might bring. So we didn't go about defining industrial scale in a detailed sort of megawatt type way, but rather the definition that I provided, which is really we're seeing that an industrial type scale project would be one that's trying to provide energy to the broader grid, as opposed to meeting the needs of a local set of communities. So that's the definition that we are using at this point. In terms of federal waters, I think that the main issue that projects are going to come into is that the project in its entirety, including the transmission line, will need to meet our standards and be evaluated for the effects that it has on the resources and uses, and that we don't have any prohibitions against sea cables in our plan. We do have recommendations about how those projects and their different types of elements, including cables, can help potentially avoid and minimize impacts, such as burying cables. So there are a number of recommendations included in the current draft management framework that speak to certain components of what would be needed to be seen. But I think it's really going to depend on the kind of project and where specifically it's being proposed.
Terrific. Thank you. And thank you, all of you, for presenting and for staying a few minutes beyond our designated time for answering some of these questions. Apologies that we can't get to all of them, and I hope that there's been plenty of information and contact information as well for you to get follow-up information. This concludes our webinar. Again, it has been recorded, and the recording of this webinar is going to be posted on our Clean Energy Group website. You will receive an email with a link to the audio and the slides, possibly later today or tomorrow. We hope you've enjoyed this webinar. Please feel free to stay connected to our work via our social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, and we also have an electronic newsletter which you can sign up for via the link. Thanks again to all the panelists and everyone who listened in today.